The gavel had not yet fallen when Stephen Lockhart put his horse between the auctioneer's crate and the crowd, and the whole yard of Grady's Ford went still enough to hear the river ice groaning half a mile off. "That is not your property to sell, Mr. Prout," Stephen said, his voice pitched to carry over the wind but not to shout. "Step back from the block." The auctioneer, a thin man named Orville Prout who worked for hire and asked no questions about the papers put in his hands, looked past Stephen's horse toward the buggy where Elias Crane sat wrapped in a buffalo robe, watching with the patient amusement of a man who had never once in his life expected to lose. "Dr. Lockhart," Crane said pleasantly, "this is a legal foreclosure sale, properly noticed. Thomas Grady defaulted on a note held by my bank. The cattle and the west pasture go to satisfy the debt. I understand your concern for your patients, but this is a matter of commerce, not medicine." "I have been treating Thomas Grady for 6 weeks," Stephen said. "I know what he owes and what he has paid because I have sat at his kitchen table while he counted it out in coin for the last 3 notes. This is the 4th. There is no record of a 4th note because there was never a 4th note taken." "There is a ledger," Crane said, "and the ledger says otherwise." That was when Sadie Grady came around the corner of the barn with a shotgun broken open over her arm, not raised, not threatening, but present in a way that made 3 of Crane's hired men go quiet and careful. "The ledger is a lie," she said. "My father has kept his own accounts since before I could write my letters, and I have kept them since I could. Bring your book here into the daylight, Mr. Crane, and let the doctor and half this county look at the ink. New ink does not match old ink, no matter how careful the hand that adds a line." Stephen had heard of Sadie Grady before he ever laid eyes on her, the schoolteacher from Cedar Bend who had spent a year petitioning the county for a schoolhouse and had been refused twice, once for want of funds and once, more quietly, because certain men on the school board did not care for a woman who argued with them in public meetings. He had pictured someone thin and pinched with disapproval. He had not pictured a woman standing in a frozen dooryard with her chin up and her father's shotgun steady on her arm, daring a banker to defend his own handwriting. "Bring the ledger forward," Stephen said again, and this time it was not a request. "I have signed enough documents in my life to know a fresh entry from an old one. If I am wrong, I will apologize to you in front of every man here and pay for the privilege of my error." Crane's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. "The ledger is at my office in Salmon, Doctor. I did not carry my books to a cattle sale." "Then the sale is postponed," Stephen said, "until the ledger can be examined by someone besides the man who benefits from it." A murmur went through the crowd, ranchers and their wives who had driven their wagons out in bitter cold to see a neighbor's cattle sold out from under him, some out of morbid curiosity, some, Stephen suspected, wondering uneasily whether their own notes might someday be found to carry a 4th payment nobody remembered making. Thomas Grady stood by the porch rail, gray-faced and thin from the pneumonia that had nearly taken him at the 1st of December, one hand braced on the post to keep himself upright. He had not spoken. Stephen guessed he did not trust his voice not to break. "This is irregular," Crane said, and for the first time there was an edge under the pleasantness. "So is stealing a man's cattle on invented paper," Sadie said. "Go on home, Mr. Prout. There will be no sale here today." Prout, who was paid by the job and not by the argument, closed his book without needing to be asked twice and climbed up into his own wagon. Crane sat a moment longer, his gaze moving from Sadie to Stephen and back, weighing something. "You have made yourself part of a dispute that is not your concern, Doctor," Crane said finally. "A man's health is my concern," Stephen answered. "And a fever like the one that put Thomas Grady flat on his back for 3 weeks tends to come back twice as hard if he is dragged out into weather like this to watch his life's work sold for a debt he does not owe. I would call that a medical opinion." Crane laughed, short and without humor, and signaled his driver to turn the buggy. But as it rolled past Sadie, he leaned out just far enough to be heard by her alone, though Stephen, close enough, caught it too. "There is another way to settle this, Miss Grady," Crane said. one that would spare your father a great deal of trouble. You might think on it before the circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks' time and finds your father owing a debt he cannot pay, with nothing left to pay it with. Debtor's prison is a cold place this time of year." Then he was gone, wheels crunching away over frozen ruts, and the yard let out its breath all at once, neighbors coming forward to help Thomas Grady inside, to ask Sadie what in the world that had meant, to thank Stephen with hard, cold handshakes for a thing none of them had expected a stranger to do. Sadie broke the shotgun the rest of the way open, emptied the shells into her palm, and looked at Stephen properly for the first time. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," Stephen agreed, "but I have delivered half the babies and set half the bones between here and Elkhorn Crossing, and I intend to keep doing it for people who are still on their land. Besides," he allowed himself the smallest smile, "I have never once in my life enjoyed watching a man like Crane get exactly what he wants. You will make an enemy of him. I believe I already have." Sadie studied him a moment longer, weighing something the way her father did when a horse trader swore an animal was sound. "Well," she said, "you had better come in and warm yourself, Dr. Lockhart, before you take a chill playing the hero in my dooryard. My father will want to thank you properly, and I expect you will want to look at his chest again before you ride on." "I would," Stephen said, and followed her inside, not yet knowing that he had just ridden into the middle of the only fight in the Salmon River Valley that would matter more to him than his own wedding. Thomas Grady's cough had eased since December but had not left him, and Stephen spent a careful quarter-hour with his ear against the old man's back, listening for the wet rattle that would mean the fever was building again rather than burning out. Sadie hovered at the edge of the room with the particular restlessness of a woman who wanted to be useful and had run out of obvious ways to be so. "He will do," Stephen said finally, straightening. "Rest, warm broth, no arguing with bankers in the cold for the next fortnight if it can be helped." "He picked a fine day to defy that instruction," Sadie said dryly, and her father, from his chair by the stove, managed a rasping laugh. "A man's got to see his own robbery, girl. Wasn't going to hide in bed for it." "You will hide in bed the next time," Sadie told him, in a tone that suggested this argument was old and well-worn between them, and Stephen found himself unexpectedly charmed by the easy back-and-forth of it, the plain evidence of two people who loved each other without much softness in the saying of it. "Tell me about the note," Stephen said when Thomas had settled again. "The one Crane claims you owe." Thomas's jaw worked. "Took a loan 2 winters back when the cattle prices fell, and I needed seed money to hold the herd over. $300, paid down in installments, same as always. I have paid every note on time since my wife died, doctor, because I promised her I would keep this ranch whole for Sadie. I do not know where this 4th debt comes from. I never signed for it. May I see your receipts?" Sadie was already moving toward the cedar box on the mantel before her father could answer, and Stephen understood in that gesture something about her that he would come to understand more deeply in the weeks ahead, that she did not wait to be told what needed doing. The receipts laid out on the kitchen table told a plain story: 3 payments, each signed by Crane's own clerk, each dated and witnessed. There was no 4th. "He means to invent one," Stephen said slowly, "and dare you to prove a negative, that you never signed something does not show up anywhere but in the absence of a paper, and absences are hard to argue in a courtroom." "Then we will need more than an absence," Sadie said. "We will need his ledger itself, and someone who can say the new entry does not match the old ink, as you said in the yard, or better, someone who saw him write it. You believe there is such a person?" "I believe Elias Crane has done this before," Sadie said. "There are 3 other ranches along this river that lost land to a note nobody remembered signing over the last 2 years. Everyone whispers it. Nobody has proven it because nobody has had the time or the standing to go asking, and because the men it happened to were ashamed or afraid or both." Stephen looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the particular metallic smell of a hard freeze coming down out of the mountains. "I ride a circuit," he said. "Cedar Bend, Bitterroot Camp, Elkhorn Crossing, and back, every 10 days or so, tending to whoever needs tending. I know most of those families. If you were of a mind to go asking questions along that same route, I could see you safely from one place to the next, and you could see me safely too, in the matter of not freezing in a snowbank, which has nearly happened to me twice this winter already from riding half asleep." Sadie's eyebrows rose. "You are offering to be my escort, Dr. Lockhart." "I am offering to be your traveling companion," Stephen said, "since I am already going where you need to go, and 2 horses through a hard winter are safer than 1. I do not need a protector. I did not say you did. I said I was already riding that way, and it would be foolish for both of us to ride alone through country that will kill a person just as dead whether they are righteous or not." Thomas Grady, from his chair, made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough. "Go with him, Sadie. I would rather worry about you freezing next to a doctor than freezing alone." Sadie looked between the two of them, some argument dying behind her teeth before it was born, and Stephen thought he saw, for just a moment, the corner of her mouth twitched toward a smile she was not yet ready to give him outright. 3 weeks, she said. "That is the deadline Crane gave. We will need proof before the circuit judge comes through, or my father loses this ranch on invented paper. I can be ready to ride at first light." "Then I will meet you here," Stephen said, and rose to go, already turning over in his mind the roads and the river crossings, and the particular danger of the cold snap the sky was promising, not yet turning over, though he would soon enough, the danger of riding beside a woman whose courage sat in her spine like a second skeleton. He did not tell Sadie Grady, that first evening, that he was engaged to be married in the spring to Louisa Marsh, whose father kept the only apothecary and supply house between Salmon and the mining camps up the Yankee Fork, and whose goodwill Stephen depended on for the laudanum and quinine and carbolic acid that kept half the valley's children alive through fever season. It was not a secret exactly. It simply did not occur to him that it needed saying, the way a man does not announce which direction is north before setting out on a road he has ridden 100 times. He thought of Louisa on the ride home that night, the way he always thought of her lately, with a fondness that had gone thin and quiet, like a coal banked too long, giving warmth without much light. They had been promised to each other for 2 years, since his father and her father had shaken hands over the arrangement at a time when Stephen was newly returned from his medical training in Portland and grateful simply to have a place and a purpose in the valley that had raised him. Louisa was steady and capable, and did not complain when he was called out at 3 in the morning to a difficult berth 40 miles upriver. He respected her. He had told himself for 2 years that respect was the better half of love, the part that lasted after the other part burned down to embers. He did not examine, that first night, why the thought of Sadie Grady's chin lifted against a banker's threat stayed with him longer than any thought of Louisa had in months. They set out from Grady's Ford at first light 3 days later, once Stephen had finished his rounds at Cedar Bend, and Sadie had settled her father with a neighbor woman to look in on him. The cold had deepened in the meantime into the kind of bitter, bone-hard freeze that old-timers along the river called a silver snap, when the air itself seemed to ring like struck metal, and a man's breath crystallized on his own collar before it left his mouth. The Salmon River had locked up solid enough in the shallows to walk across, though Stephen warned Sadie against trusting the ice anywhere the current ran deep and fast beneath it. "I grew up on this river, Doctor," Sadie said, not unkindly, as their horses picked their way along the frozen bank trail toward Elkhorn Crossing. "I know which ice will hold a person and which will not." "Then you know more than half the fools who drown in it every winter," Stephen said, "who also grew up on this river and also thought they knew. Is that meant to reassure me or frighten me?" "Neither. It is meant to keep you off the deep ice, which I would very much like to do, since I have no wish to explain to your father how I managed to lose you in the first week of an escort I volunteered for against your objections." Sadie laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, as though it had gotten away from her before she could decide whether Stephen deserved it. "You do not strike me as a man given to volunteering for things, Dr. Lockhart. I have been told I have a weakness for lost causes. Is that what my father's ranch is? A lost cause?" "No," Stephen said more seriously. "I do not believe it is lost at all. I believe it is a cause that has simply not yet found the right proof. There is a difference." They rode in silence a while after that, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the muffled thud of hooves on packed snow, the river beside them groaning under its ice like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Stephen found himself watching Sadie from the corner of his eye, the practical way she sat a horse, no wasted motion, no complaint about the cold though her breath came in ragged white plumes, and her gloved hands stayed tucked close to the reins. She had brought a second scarf, he noticed, wound high enough to cover her nose against the wind, and a small oilskin satchel that he guessed held whatever papers and letters she had already collected in her campaign to prove Crane's fraud. "Tell me about your school," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel less like peace and more like waiting. Sadie glanced at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because you have ridden 3 hours in weather that would keep most sensible people by their own stove, in pursuit of a schoolhouse you do not yet have, for children some of whom belong to families that voted against you twice. I find that I would like to understand why." For a moment he thought she would deflect the question the way she had deflected his offer of escort, out of pure stubborn independence. Instead, something in her face softened, turned inward. "My mother taught me my letters before she died," Sadie said. "There was no school in Cedar Bend then, and there is none now, and the nearest one is 2 days' ride for families that cannot spare a child from chores for 2 days, let alone the winter months when the roads close entirely. I have watched bright children, real bright ones, doctor, the kind who ask questions that would embarrass a college man, grow up unable to read a note their own father is cheated on, because nobody thought girls or ranch boys needed more than their letters and their sums. I mean to change that if the county board will ever stop finding reasons to say no. What reasons have they given? Money first. Then, when a fund was raised mostly by the mothers, going door to door with a coffee can, the reason changed to propriety. A woman my age, unmarried, running a schoolhouse on her own, with boys as old as 16 among her pupils. As though I have not been minding my father's cattle and keeping his books since I was 12, and could not mind a room of children without some man's supervision. That seems a poor argument, Stephen said. It is a poor argument. It is also the argument that has cost me 2 years. And Crane, where does he sit in this? Sadie's mouth thinned. He sits on the school board, Dr. Lockhart. He has voted against the schoolhouse both times quietly, without ever giving a public reason. I did not understand why until my father's trouble began. Now I wonder whether it was never truly about the school at all, whether he simply did not want a woman with a coffee can, and a following of mothers becoming someone people in this valley trust and listen to. A woman like that asks questions. A woman like that notices new ink in an old ledger. Stephen turned that over as they rode, the shape of it settling into place with an unpleasant click, like a bone reset. "You think he opposed the school to keep you small?" "I think," Sadie said, "that men like Elias Crane do not fear guns or lawsuits half so much as they fear a witness who can read." They reached the frozen shallows below Elkhorn Crossing as the light was failing, the sky gone the hard flat white of a sky about to drop more snow, and Stephen called a halt at a line shack he knew belonged to old Amos Prout. No relation to the auctioneer, a fact Sadie found darkly funny, who let travelers shelter there in exchange for whatever firewood they could spare from his stack. There was one room, one stove, and 2 narrow bunks built into the wall, and Stephen felt the particular awkwardness of the arrangement settle over both of them as he got the fire going and Sadie unpacked the biscuits and dried venison she had brought from home. "I will sleep by the door," Stephen said, "if that eases your mind any." "It was not troubling my mind especially," Sadie said, though the quickness of her answer suggested otherwise. "I have shared worse shelter with worse company, minding cattle in a blizzard. You at least know how to build a fire that does not smoke us both out the window. High praise. Do not let it go to your head, doctor." They ate in a companionable quiet that surprised Stephen with how easily it had arrived, given how the day had started. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind found every gap in the shack's boards and made a thin, searching sound like something looking for a way in. "May I ask you something personal?" Sadie said eventually, arms wrapped around her knees where she sat close to the stove. "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." "Why does a trained doctor, a man who could set up a fine practice in Boise or even go back east, spend his winters freezing half to death, riding a circuit between 3 camps that can barely pay him in eggs and firewood?" Stephen considered the question longer than its plainness might have warranted. "My father rode a similar circuit before me," he said finally. "Not as a doctor, there was no doctor here then, not a trained one, but as a kind of general help, setting bones as best he knew how, delivering babies when the midwife could not be reached in time. He was not a good doctor because he had no training, only willingness. I watched him lose a woman to childbed fever when I was 11 years old, a fever I now know could have been prevented with cleaner hands and a bit of carbolic soap, and I decided that winter that I would go and learn properly what he had only guessed at and come back and do it right. And you did." "I did. Though I still lose people, Sadie Grady, more than I would like. The cold takes them, or the distance takes them, dying on a trail I could not reach in time. I have not yet found a cure for either one." Sadie was quiet a moment. "You called me Sadie Grady," she said, "not Miss Grady." Stephen felt his ears warm despite the cold. "My apologies, it slipped out." "I did not say I minded it," Sadie said, and looked away first into the fire, and Stephen found himself smiling at the stove in a way he was glad the dark half hid. They reached Elkhorn Crossing the following afternoon, and it was there that Stephen's medical rounds and Sadie's search for evidence first tangled together in a way neither of them had planned. The Whitfield family, whose 2 boys Stephen had treated for whooping cough not a month before, greeted them warmly, and it was Ada Whitfield, stirring a pot over her stove, who mentioned almost in passing, "The way people speak of old grief they have stopped expecting anyone to care about," that they had lost 40 acres of good bottomland to Elias Crane 2 winters back, over a note her husband swore they had already paid in full. "We had no proof," Ada said, when Sadie pressed her, gently, careful not to reopen a wound too fast. "Just Henry's word against the banker's book. Nobody believed a small rancher over a man with a ledger and a lawyer in Salmon." "Would you say so before the circuit judge if I could show the same has happened to others?" Sadie asked. Ada glanced at her husband, who had come in from the barn in time to hear the tale of it, his face gone hard and careful in the way of a man who has learned that hope costs more than it is worth when it fails to pay out. "I would," Henry Whitfield said slowly, "if I thought it would do a lick of good and not just cost us the roof still over our heads for the trouble of speaking against him." "It might do both," Stephen said honestly. "I will not lie to you about the risk. But I have seen the ledger's forged entry against Thomas Grady, in the man's own dooryard, and I believe with 2 families willing to say the same thing happened to them, a judge would have to look harder than Crane would like." It was the first solid thread, not proof yet, but the shape proof might eventually take in Sadie's eyes, when she looked at Stephen across Ada Whitfield's kitchen table, held something that had not been there the day before, a warmth that went beyond gratitude for an escort into something more like partnership. They found a second thread at Bitterroot Camp 2 days later, in the person of a young man named Foster Reams, who had clerked for Crane's Bank until the previous autumn, when he had quit without explanation and taken work instead cutting timber for the mining camps. Stephen had come to look at a broken arm on one of the loggers and found Foster there, thinner than Stephen remembered from town, with the wary look of a man who had been running from something for months without ever quite outrunning it. "I will not say anything against Mr. Crane," Foster said, when Sadie carefully raised the subject, "over coffee in the cook shack. I have a mother to look after in Salmon, and Crane holds the note on her house too." "Did you see him alter an entry?" Sadie asked. "You do not have to say yes or no in front of anyone but me and the doctor. I only need to know." Foster's hands, wrapped around his coffee tin, had gone white at the knuckles. He looked at Stephen for a long moment as though trying to read whether this was a trap. "I saw him do it 3 times, Foster said finally low. "Always the same way. He would wait until a rancher had nearly paid off a note, then add a line in the same ink, the same hand, dated to match an old page, showing a new loan taken out that never happened. He kept a bottle of the same brand ink on his desk for exactly that purpose, so the color would not give it away to a careless eye. I quit the day he asked me to witness one of the false entries with my own signature. I would not do it. I have been running from him since." "Would you say this to a judge?" Stephen asked. Foster's laugh was thin and bitter. "And lose my mother's house the same week? No, doctor. I am sorry for Thomas Grady and sorry for the Whitfields, but I cannot afford to be a hero." Sadie leaned forward. "What if your mother's note were paid off by the time you testified? What if there were nothing left for Crane to hold over you?" Foster stared at her. "You would do that?" "I do not have that kind of money," Sadie admitted. "But there may be others in this valley who would rather see justice done than watch Crane keep eating them one ranch at a time. I have been collecting a school fund for 2 years, Mr. Reams. I believe I can collect a different kind of fund a good deal faster if the cause is plain enough." It was, Stephen thought, watching her, one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen a person do: turn a stranger's fear into a plan inside the space of a single conversation, offering not comfort but a solution, practical and immediate. He found he was no longer thinking of her as a woman he was escorting for safety's sake. He was thinking of her as someone he wanted, quite badly, to keep beside him for reasons that had very little to do with Thomas Grady's ranch at all. The trouble came on the road back from Bitterroot Camp, 3 days later, in the gray hour before full dark, when 2 riders came out of the trees ahead of them and made no pretense of a chance meeting. "Miss Grady," one of them said. Stephen recognized him as one of the men who had stood near Crane's buggy at the aborted auction, a broad-faced hired hand named Dutch Ferris. "Mr. Crane sends his regards and a bit of advice. He would suggest you and the doctor turn around and go home. There is nothing further along this road for you to find." "We will decide that for ourselves," Stephen said, moving his horse a half step in front of Sadie's without quite thinking about why. "I did not ask you, doctor," Ferris said. "This is between Mr. Crane and the lady." "It is between Mr. Crane and the law," Sadie said, "and you may tell him I said so." Ferris's companion, a lean man Stephen did not recognize, walked his horse a few steps closer, and for a moment the air went taut with the particular danger of men deciding whether violence was worth the trouble it would cause them. Stephen's hand moved, slow and visible, to rest on the old Colt he carried more from habit than expectation of using it, a doctor's gun, meant for putting down an injured horse more often than defending himself, but a gun all the same, and Ferris's eyes tracked the movement and did not care for it. "There is no need for that," Ferris said, a shade less certain now. "We are only delivering a message." "Then deliver it and go," Stephen said, "because I do not intend to sit my horse in the freezing dark discussing your employer's opinions any longer than I have to." The 2 riders held a moment longer, some silent calculation passing between them, and then Ferris nudged his mount aside. "You will regret not listening, Miss Grady," he said as they rode past. "Mr. Crane is not a patient man once he decides a thing is settled." They did not speak again until the riders had vanished back into the trees and the sound of their hoofbeats had faded into the wind. Sadie's hands, Stephen saw, were shaking slightly on her reins, though her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "That was meant to frighten us." "It worked, a little," Stephen admitted. "I will not pretend it did not." "Are you hurt, frightened past sense needing to stop?" No, Sadie said, angrier than frightened if I am honest. She looked at him, something new in her expression, not quite gratitude, something closer to reckoning. You put yourself in front of me back there. I did not decide to. It simply happened. That is usually how the truest things happen, Sadie said quietly, and they rode on into the dark without further words, though something had shifted between them that neither was yet ready to name aloud. They reached Cedar Bend 2 days after that, cold and saddle-sore and carrying, in Sadie's oilskin satchel, the beginnings of a case that might yet save Thomas Grady's ranch. Ada and Henry Whitfield's willingness to speak, Foster Reams's account, not yet given but not entirely refused either, and Stephen's own observations of the ledger from that first day in the dooryard. It was not enough yet. But it was more than they had carried out with them, and for the first time since the auction, Sadie allowed herself something like hope. The hope did not last the week. Word came to Cedar Bend by way of a boy sent riding hard from Salmon. Foster Reams had been let go from his timber job without explanation, and had disappeared from the boarding house where he lodged, leaving no word to anyone, including his own mother, whose note Sadie learned with a sinking heart had been called due in full, payable within the week, an impossible sum for a woman of her circumstances to raise. He has frightened him off, Sadie said, pacing the small parlor of the Cedar Bend boarding house where they had stopped to take stock. Or bought him off, or worse. Either way, we have lost our best witness. We have not lost the Whitfields, Stephen said, though he could hear how thin the comfort sounded even as he offered it. One family's word against a banker's ledger. It did not save my father the first time. It will not save him now. Sadie stopped pacing and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, the first sign of exhaustion Stephen had seen crack her composure since the auction. The hearing is in 11 days, Stephen. It was the first time she had used his given name, and even in the middle of her distress, some part of him noted it and held onto it like a coal to keep. There is worse, said the boy who had brought the message, still hovering by the door, cap in his hands. I near forgot in the telling. Mr. Crane has put it about in Salmon that Miss Grady's father cannot meet his obligations, and that the debt might be settled a different way. He says his nephew Whitman has offered marriage to Miss Grady as of a kindness to spare the family the shame of the courthouse, and that the wedding is to be arranged directly, on account of the circuit judge's early arrival, so as to settle the matter before the hearing rather than after. Sadie went very still. The judge is coming early. Word in town says he has moved his circuit up on account of the weather, wanting to clear his docket before a bigger storm sets in. He is due in 8 days now, not 11, and Mr. Crane means for the wedding to happen before that, so there is nothing left for the judge to rule on. A married woman's property becomes her husband's, does it not? If Miss Grady weds Mr. Whitman, the ranch and the debt become the same family's business, and no fraud is left to prove, because there is nothing left to take. Stephen felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. He means to marry you into silence, he said slowly. Before the judge can hear a single word of testimony. He has told my father, the boy added miserably, that if Miss Grady refuses, the debt stands as written, and Mr. Grady will be taken to the county jail in Salmon the day after the hearing, on his condition in this cold. He says Mr. Grady may not live out the sentence, being as sick as he has been. Sadie's face had gone the color of old ash. That is a lie, she whispered. The debt is a lie. He is threatening my father's life with a lie to force a marriage that would bury the truth of his own crime. Yes, Stephen said, and it is a very clever lie because it does not need to be believed by a judge. It only needs to be believed by you and by your father long enough for the wedding to happen. I will not marry Whitman Crane, Sadie said, low and fierce. I would rather see my father in that jail cell myself and spend every day fighting to free him than sell myself to save him from a debt that does not exist. Your father may not agree so easily, Stephen said gently. Not if he believes the choice is your happiness against his life. Sadie's eyes, when they met his, were bright with unshed tears. She was clearly furious at herself for allowing. Then we have 8 days to prove the ledger is false, Dr. Lockhart, and find some way to stop a wedding that has not even been properly asked of me yet, only announced, as though I were a heifer already sold. 8 days, Stephen agreed, and felt the deadline settle over both of them like a weight neither could set down. They rode for salmon the next morning, reasoning that whatever proof remained to be found, Foster Reams, if he could be located, the ledger itself, if it could somehow be examined by an impartial hand before Crane thought to hide or destroy it, would have to be found in town, close to the source of the trouble rather than farther from it. It was on that ride, crossing the wide flat stretch below two forks where the wind came down off the mountains with nothing to break it, that the weather turned in a way that nearly cost them both their lives, and that Stephen would look back on, in later years, as the day he understood fully what Sadie Grady was made of. The sky, which had been a hard, flat gray all morning, began to spit fine, dry snow around midday, and within an hour the wind had risen into something that drove the snow sideways, stinging any exposed skin like thrown gravel. Stephen had seen ground blizzards before, had lost a patient's father to one 3 winters back, a man who had wandered in circles less than a quarter mile from his own barn until the cold took him. He knew the particular terror of a whiteout on open ground, when a rider could lose all sense of direction in the space of a few minutes. "We need shelter," he shouted over the wind. "Now, not in an hour." "There is a line shack a mile ahead, along the old fence row," Sadie called back. "If we can hold the fence line, we will not lose our way." They rode with their horses' heads low and their own faces buried in scarves, one hand each on the barbed wire fence that Sadie navigated by feel as much as sight, until at last the dark shape of a shack loomed up out of the white and they half fell from their saddles to get the horses and themselves inside. Stephen's hands, by the time he got the door latched against the wind, had gone past aching into a dull, dangerous numbness he recognized with professional alarm. "Your hands," Sadie said, seeing his face. "Let me see them. They will be fine in a moment once." "Dr. Lockhart, I have seen frostbite take a man's fingers on this river, and I will not sit here debating with you while it happens to yours. Give me your hands." There was no arguing with the tone, and Stephen, feeling faintly absurd at being ordered about by his own patient's daughter, held out his hands and let her strip off his gloves and tuck his fingers, ungently but effectively, beneath her own coat and against the warmth of her body, her arms wrapped tight around them. "This is a highly unorthodox treatment," Stephen managed, through chattering teeth. "It is the treatment you would have prescribed for anyone else within the first minute of meeting them," Sadie said. "Body warmth, direct contact, no rubbing, which I know because I have heard you say as much to half the ranchers on this river. You are simply too stubborn to prescribe it for yourself. An occupational hazard among doctors." "An occupational hazard among men," Sadie corrected, but there was no real heat in it, and Stephen, held against her, felt the ache in his hands slowly give way to a different kind of awareness entirely. The nearness of her, the smell of wood smoke and cold wool, and something underneath that was simply Sadie, the sound of her heartbeat close enough to hear over the storm outside. "Thank you," he said quietly, when feeling had returned enough that he could flex his fingers again. "You would have done the same for me." "I would," Stephen agreed. "I find, though, that I am rather glad it happened to me instead, if only because it means I got to see you be fierce about it." Sadie laughed, startled again into that unguarded sound he had come to listen for. "You are a strange man, Stephen Lockhart, to find frostbite romantic." "I did not say frostbite was romantic. I said you were." The words were out before he had fully decided to say them, and he watched her face change, surprise giving way to something more careful, more considering. "You are engaged to be married," she said, not unkindly but as a fact laid plainly on the table between them. "The whole valley knows it, Louisa Marsh in the spring." Stephen felt the truth of it land in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward from a fact he realized now, quietly avoiding for days. "I am," he said. "Then perhaps you ought not say such things to me." "Perhaps I ought not," Stephen agreed. "I find I want to say them anyway, which troubles me more than I can easily explain." Sadie was quiet a long moment, the wind howling outside the shack, the two of them still sitting close for warmth though the emergency of it had passed. "I will not be the reason a good man breaks a promise," she said finally. "Whatever I might wish otherwise." It was, Stephen understood, both a rejection and a confession at once, and he did not press her further, though the words she had not quite said, "whatever I might wish otherwise," stayed with him through the rest of that long cold night, warmer than any fire. They reached Salmon the following afternoon, the storm having blown itself out overnight into a hard, clear, bitter cold that made the whole valley look as though it had been carved from glass. It was there, at the boarding house where Foster Reams had last been seen, that they found not the missing clerk himself but a note he had left with the landlady, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had not been certain anyone would come looking. "Gone to my aunt's place at Two Forks," it read in a cramped, anxious hand. "Could not stay where Crane's men could find me easy. Tell Miss Grady I am sorry. I am frightened, but I have not forgotten what I saw, and if it will truly free my mother's house, I will say it before the judge. Come find me if there is still time." "There is still time," Sadie said fiercely, refolding the note. "There has to be." They found Foster Reams 2 days later at his aunt's small holding at Two Forks, thinner and more haggard than before, but resolute in a way he had not been at Bitterroot Camp. Sadie's promise about the school fund had, it turned out, already been half-kept. Word of her plan had spread along the river faster than she herself had traveled, and 3 ranching families, moved by Ada Whitfield's story and their own old grievances against Crane, had pooled enough between them to cover the debt on Foster's mother's house outright. "I do not know how to thank you," Foster said when Sadie told him. "Tell the judge the truth," Sadie said. "That will be thanks enough." But even with Foster secured, even with the Whitfield's account and Stephen's own testimony of the fresh ink he had seen in the ledger, the case remained thin against the weight of Crane's standing in the county, a banker, a school board member, a man with friends among the county officials who would need convincing that his word was worth less than a schoolteacher's and a country doctor's. And the deadline had not moved. 5 days now until the circuit judge's arrival. 5 days, they learned upon returning to Salmon, until the wedding Crane had announced would take place moved forward again, with a haste that told its own story about how afraid Crane truly was of what the judge might find if given the chance to look. "He means to have it done before the judge even sets foot in the courthouse," Sadie said, reading the notice that had been posted, with grim theatrics, outside the general store. "Miss Sadie Grady to wed Mr. Whitman Crane 5 days hence at the Salmon Community Church." "Has he even asked you?" Stephen said, low with anger. "He sent Whitman to my father 2 days past while we were at Two Forks," Sadie said. "My father told him no. Crane sent back word the same evening that the debt would be called in full, and my father arrested, unless I reconsidered by week's end. My father has not slept since, Stephen. He is half convinced already that he must let this happen to spare me the sight of him dying in a jail cell for a debt he never took." "He will not die in a jail cell," Stephen said, "because we are going to prove the debt is false before that judge, if I have to drag Elias Crane's ledger out of his office by force." "You cannot simply steal evidence," Sadie said, though without much conviction, as though she had already considered and half endorsed the idea herself. "No," Stephen agreed. "But perhaps we do not have to. Perhaps there is a more honest way to force his hand." The Chinook came down off the mountains 4 days before the wedding, a warm wind out of nowhere that took the bitter cold and turned it, within the space of a single night, into something closer to fall. Spring eaves dripping, snowbanks slumping, the whole valley smelling suddenly of wet earth and thawing pine, and the ice on the Salmon River, which had held solid for 6 weeks, beginning to groan and crack and shift in ways that every rancher along its banks recognized, with dread, for what it meant. Stephen was at Cedar Bend, treating a child's fever, when the first rider came through shouting that the ice had jammed below Elkhorn Crossing, a great logjam of broken floes piling up against the narrows there faster than the current could clear it, and that the water backing up behind it was already spreading out over the low fields where half a dozen families, the Whitfields among them, had their homes and barns. "How bad?" Stephen asked, already reaching for his coat. "Bad, doctor, and getting worse. Water's coming up the Whitfields' porch steps already. Somebody said the jam might break loose all at once and send a wall of water and ice down on Grady's Ford next, if it lets go sudden." Sadie, who had come with him to Cedar Bend to see the fevered child's mother, was already moving toward the horses before Stephen had finished pulling on his coat. "My father's ranch is below Grady's Ford," she said. "If that wall comes down, then we ride," Stephen said, "and we warn every house between here and there on the way." What followed was, Stephen would think later, the hardest and finest work he had ever been part of, riding hard along the river trail with Sadie beside him, stopping at each ranch long enough to shout the warning, and see it taken seriously before pressing on, gathering men and mules and whatever tools could be found, axes and pry bars, and even dynamite from the mining camp at Bitterroot, all of it converging by mid-afternoon on the great gray-white tangle of ice choking the river below Elkhorn Crossing. Water already spreading brown and cold across the low fields on either side. Henry Whitfield was there, up to his knees in freezing water, trying alone to build a barrier of fence rails and sod around his own barn, and Sadie was off her horse, and beside him before Stephen had even finished dismounting, directing the other arriving men with the calm authority of someone who had clearly thought, on the ride over, exactly what needed doing. "We cannot stop the water from rising," she called out, over the roar of the ice grinding against itself, "but we can channel it away from the houses if we cut a spillway through the old slough bed there, where the ground is already low. Every man with a shovel or an axe, follow me." It should have seemed strange, Stephen thought even as he grabbed a shovel himself and fell in beside her, that a schoolteacher was the one directing a river rescue while ranchers 3 times her age followed her lead without question. But it did not seem strange at all, not once you had seen her read a room, or a ledger, or a frozen river, the way she had these past weeks. She had grown up on this land. She understood its moods the way Stephen understood the moods of a fever. The work was brutal, hacking through half-frozen sod and brush in the fading light, hauling rock and fence rail to build the sides of the channel higher, while upstream the ice jam groaned and shifted and threatened at any moment to let go all at once and send the whole backed-up weight of the river down on them in a single crushing wave. Stephen worked until his arms burned and his hands, healed now from the earlier frostbite scare, blistered raw inside his gloves, and always somewhere near him, digging and hauling with the same desperate steadiness, was Sadie, her hair come loose from its pins, mud to her knees, calling out encouragement and instruction in a voice gone hoarse with shouting over the water. It was near dark when the spillway finally connected with the old slough, and the diverted water began to pour away from the Whitfields' barn and the 2 neighboring homesteads and out across open, harmless ground instead, the pressure easing almost visibly as the flood found a new path of least resistance. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted men along the bank, and Stephen, straightening from the ditch with his back screaming in protest, found Sadie beside him, soaked and filthy and laughing with the particular giddy relief of people who have just watched disaster turn aside at the last possible moment. "We did it," she said. "Stephen, we did it." "You did it," Stephen said. "I only followed your orders same as everyone else." "Then you followed them well." She was looking up at him, firelight from the torches someone had lit catching the exhaustion and triumph both in her face, and Stephen, without entirely deciding to, reached up and brushed a smear of mud from her cheek with his thumb, his hand lingering there a moment longer than the task required. "Sadie," he said low. I have spent 3 weeks telling myself that what I feel for you is only the ordinary fondness a man feels for a brave and capable traveling companion. I do not believe that any longer. Sadie's breath caught, visible in the cold evening air. Stephen, your wedding, I know, he said. I'm not asking you to answer me tonight, or to carry that weight along with everything else you are already carrying. I only wanted you to know it, plainly, before whatever comes next in these 5 days that are left to us. She did not pull away from his hand. I have been telling myself the same lie, she admitted softly. That what I feel is only gratitude, only the closeness that comes of shared danger. I do not believe it either, not anymore. Around them, the men were already turning back toward their homes, their voices carrying the particular loose, relieved cheerfulness of a crisis survived together, and neither Stephen nor Sadie moved to join them just yet, standing instead in the cold and the dark with the sound of the freed river running gently past, no longer a threat but simply a river again, doing what rivers do. I should not want anything to come between us and this, Sadie said finally, stepping back, though gently, not in rejection but in caution. Not the ranch, not the wedding you are promised to, not any of it. I want it to be simple, Stephen, and I know it is not simple at all. No, Stephen agreed. It is not simple, but I find that I no longer wish for simple, if the alternative is not knowing you. They rode back to Grady's Ford together in a silence that was not awkward but full, charged with everything neither of them had said outright. And Stephen understood, somewhere on that dark ride, that whatever happened with Louisa, whatever happened with the wedding notice posted outside the Salmon General store, he could not now walk away from what had grown between himself and Sadie Grady. The only question left was whether he would find the courage to say so before it was too late for either of them. The flood, as it turned out, did more than save 3 homesteads from ruin. In the chaos of the ice jam, a great slab of shifted river ice had torn loose part of the old bank below Crane's own property outside Salmon, exposing a root cellar that had, according to the elderly tenant who farmed the land on Crane's behalf, been used years back to store the bank's older ledgers before a proper vault was built in town. Among the waterlogged boxes the tenant hauled out to save from further ruin was a battered account book from 3 years past, the very year, Sadie realized with a jolt, that the first disputed note against Thomas Grady's neighbors had supposedly been taken out. The tenant, an old widower named Silas Cobb, who owed Crane no particular loyalty and rather more resentment over a decade of hard rent, was persuaded easily enough to let Sadie and Stephen examine the book, once Sadie explained plainly what they suspected. There, in careful, damning contrast to the newer ledger Crane had shown at the courthouse, was the original record of the Whitfield family's loan, paid in full, the same date the newer ledger claimed a fresh debt had been taken. The ink in the old book, faded and consistent, told the story that Foster Reams's memory alone could not have proven in court, that the debt Crane claimed had simply never existed, invented after the fact and backdated in a second, forged version of events. This is it, Sadie breathed, turning the fragile pages with careful hands. Stephen, this is proof, real proof, not just our word against his. We need to get this into the judge's hands before the wedding, Stephen said. Not after. Once you are married to Whitman, even a judge who believes every word of this may find his hands tied by the law of coverture. Your father's debt becomes family business the moment those vows are spoken, and Crane knows it. 4 days, Sadie said. The judge is not due until 3 days after the wedding is set to happen. Then we go to him early, Stephen said. Wherever his circuit has him now, we do not wait for him to come to us. They learned from a rider passing through Salmon that the judge, a stern, fair-minded circuit rider named Judge Harmon Teal, well known and generally well liked along the river for his impatience with exactly the kind of paper tricks Crane favored, was currently 2 days' hard ride away at a mining camp on the Yankee Fork, finishing an earlier docket before continuing on to Salmon. 2 days there if the weather held. 1 day back if they were fortunate. It would be close, desperately close, with the wedding set for the day after their likely return. But it was, Stephen and Sadie agreed, riding out that same afternoon with Silas Cobb's old ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the only chance they had. It was on the ride to the Yankee Fork, through country even wilder and more broken than the river valley they had grown used to, that Stephen found himself facing the second half of the promise he had made weeks before, in a dooryard full of frightened cattle, without ever imagining it would cost him quite this much. A letter reached them at a relay station along the way, forwarded on from Salmon, from Louisa Marsh, in her own careful hand, asking, with the particular gentle patience of a woman who suspected something without yet being told outright, whether Stephen still intended to be home in time for their wedding, now only 6 days away, or whether his circuit and his new traveling companion meant to keep him longer than planned. Stephen read it twice, standing in the cold outside the relay station while Sadie waited tactfully with the horses. "Bad news?" she asked when he came to remount. "Not bad," Stephen said slowly. "Only true, and true things are sometimes harder than bad ones." He folded the letter away. "Louisa asks when I am coming home for our wedding." Sadie's face carefully gave nothing away. "You should answer her." "I should," Stephen agreed. "I do not yet know what honest answer I have to give." They found Judge Teal on the second evening at the mining camp on the Yankee Fork, finishing his docket by lamplight in a rough plank courtroom that smelled of pine sap and coal smoke. He was a lean, gray-whiskered man with tired eyes that missed very little, and he listened to Sadie's account, the auction, the forged ledger, the Whitfield family's loss, Foster Reams's testimony, and finally the old waterlogged ledger recovered from Crane's own root cellar without once interrupting, his expression giving away nothing until she had finished entirely. "This is a serious accusation, Miss Grady," Judge Teal said finally. "Fraud against a banker of Elias Crane's standing is not a thing I will rule on lightly, based on a schoolteacher's say-so and a bundle of old papers." "I understand that, Your Honor," Sadie said, steady despite the judge's flat tone. "That is why I did not come only with my own say-so. Dr. Lockhart witnessed the fresh ink himself, in Crane's own ledger, before witnesses at the aborted auction. Foster Reams, formerly Crane's own clerk, will testify under oath to having seen him alter entries by hand, on more than one occasion. And this ledger, recovered from Crane's own property, shows the original, honest record of at least one debt he later claimed did not exist. I am not asking you to take my word, Your Honor. I am asking you to look at the evidence and judge for yourself, as I understand is precisely your job." Something in the judge's tired face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to respect. "You argue like a lawyer, Miss Grady." "I argue like a woman who has watched her father nearly lose everything to a lie," Sadie said. "I have simply had a great deal of practice lately." Judge Teal studied the old ledger for a long, silent while, comparing pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. Finally, he set it down and looked up at both of them. "I was due in Salmon in 3 days regardless," he said. "I will move my schedule and be there in 2 if the roads allow. I want Foster Reams present, and the Whitfields, and this ledger kept safe, and in my own possession from this moment forward, Miss Grady, so that no one has occasion to claim it went missing or was tampered with along the way." "There is one more matter, Your Honor," Stephen said. "Crane has arranged for Miss Grady to be married to his nephew, day after tomorrow, before you are due to arrive. He means to settle the property question by marriage before the law can rule on the fraud." Judge Teal's expression darkened. "Has he now?" He was quiet a moment, thinking. "I cannot forbid a wedding, Doctor. Marriage is not a matter for my circuit unless there is fraud or coercion proven in the arranging of it, and that is a harder thing to show than a false ledger entry. But I will tell you this. If that wedding happens before I arrive, and if it is later shown that it was arranged specifically to defeat a legitimate legal claim, I have considerable latitude to set the marriage's property effects aside as fraudulent in intent, whatever the county clerk's book says. It would be a long fight and an ugly one, and I would rather you spared Miss Grady the need of it." "So would I," Stephen said grimly. "We will do everything in our power to stop the wedding before it happens, Your Honor." "See that you do," Judge Teal said. "I will ride as fast as the road allows. I cannot promise it will be fast enough." They rode back toward Salmon through the night and the following day, pushing their horses harder than either of them liked, aware with every mile of the deadline closing in, the wedding now only a day and a half away, the judge perhaps a day behind them at best. It was on that desperate ride, exhausted and saddle-sore and increasingly afraid that they would not make it in time, that the last piece of the personal reckoning Stephen had been avoiding finally caught up with him, in the form of his own wedding day, which, he realized with something like vertigo, was now only 2 days off, the very day, as it happened, before Sadie's. They reached Salmon at dusk, and it was there, dismounting stiff and filthy outside the boarding house, that Stephen found Louisa Marsh waiting for him on the porch, her face composed in the careful, patient way he had known for 2 years and never once, until this moment, fully understood the cost of. "Stephen," she said, "I had begun to wonder if you meant to come home at all before Saturday." "Louisa," he glanced at Sadie, who had the grace and good sense to busy herself with the horses rather than stand witness to whatever came next. "I owe you a conversation I have been putting off far longer than I should have." Louisa's chin lifted, some old dignity settling over her features. "I think I already know what it concerns, Stephen. I have known for some weeks, if I am honest with myself. You write my name in your letters the way a man writes an obligation, not a hope." Her eyes moved briefly toward where Sadie stood with the horses, and something passed over her face that was sorrow but not surprise. "Is it her?" "I did not intend for it to be," Stephen said quietly. "I have tried these past weeks to remember why I promised myself to you, and I find the honest answer is that it was a good and sensible arrangement between our fathers, and that I mistook sensible for love because I did not yet know the difference." Louisa was silent a long moment, looking out over the darkening street. "I will tell you something in return, Stephen, since you have been honest with me," she said finally. "There is a man named William Caro, who works my father's freight line, who has asked to court me properly no fewer than 3 times in the past year, and whom I have turned away each time because I had already given my word to you. I confess I have thought of him more often than I ought, these past months, and wondered whether I was not clinging to our arrangement out of the same mistaken sense of duty you have just described in yourself." Stephen felt something in his chest loosen that he had not realized was clenched so tight. "Louisa, do not apologize to me as though you have wronged me terribly, Stephen Lockhart," Louisa said, with the first real warmth he had heard in her voice in months. "I believe you have done me a kindness in the end, forcing us both to admit what we have been too polite to say aloud. I will speak to my father. There need be no wedding on Saturday, and no scandal either, if we are sensible about how it is told." "Thank you," Stephen said, and meant it with his whole battered heart. "For your grace in this, if nothing else. Go save your schoolteacher's father," Louisa said, almost smiling now. "I understand there is a rather more urgent wedding to stop than the one we are canceling." But word, as it always does in a valley strung together by gossip and necessity, traveled faster than either Stephen or Louisa intended, and it was a garbled version of the broken engagement, that Dr. Lockhart had jilted Louisa Marsh at the altar itself, rather than the truth of a mutual and grace-filled release 2 days prior, that reached Elias Crane by the following morning, along with the far more accurate and dangerous information that Stephen Lockhart and Sadie Grady had ridden to fetch Judge Teal early, carrying evidence against him. Crane's response was immediate and ruthless. He moved the wedding forward again, from the following day to that very afternoon, informing Thomas Grady by messenger that any refusal or delay would see him arrested within the hour on the strength of the debt as recorded, judge or no judge, evidence or no evidence, on the grounds that a county sheriff's warrant did not require a circuit judge's presence to be executed. Sadie, informed of this at the boarding house barely an hour before the appointed time, felt the ground drop away beneath her feet. "He means to have it done before the judge even reaches town," she said, white-faced. "This afternoon, Stephen. He has moved it to this very afternoon." "Then we stop it this afternoon," Stephen said, already moving toward the door, though even as he said it, the enormity of what stood between them and success pressed down hard. The judge not yet arrived, the evidence still technically in Judge Teal's keeping rather than presented in open court, and a sheriff, Crane's ally by long habit and small favors, who would see no legal reason to delay a wedding simply because a doctor and a schoolteacher claimed, without a judge present to confirm it, that the debt behind it was false. "They will marry us by the church, not the courthouse," Sadie said, pulling on her coat with hands that shook despite her best effort at steadiness. "There is no law requiring a judge's presence for a wedding, Stephen, only a minister and witnesses and my own signature on the register. If I sign that register, it will not matter what proof arrives an hour later." "Then you must not sign it," Stephen said. "Whatever else happens, Sadie, you cannot let that ceremony finish." "I do not intend to," Sadie said, and there was something in her voice, not fear now, but a hard, clear determination that steadied Stephen's own racing heart. "But I would rather not fight this alone if I do not have to." "You will not," Stephen said, and swung up into his saddle beside her. "I am done," Sadie Grady, riding past the things that matter most to me because some other obligation told me I must. "Whatever it costs, we ride for that church together, and we stop this before it starts." They reached the Salmon Community Church just as the last wagons were pulling up outside, a modest but curious crowd gathering in the cold, bright afternoon to witness what half the valley already suspected in whispers was no ordinary wedding. Elias Crane stood near the church steps in his best coat, the picture of solemn respectability, while his nephew Whitman, a soft, uncertain young man who Stephen suspected, had far less appetite for this scheme than his uncle, waited near the door looking as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Thomas Grady stood near the front, thin and gray but upright, flanked by the county sheriff, whose presence made plain exactly what threat had been used to bring Sadie's father to witness his own daughter's coerced wedding. Sadie dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, striding toward the church with a purpose that drew every eye in the gathered crowd, Stephen close behind her. "Miss Grady," Crane said, all false warmth, "you are nearly late to your own wedding." "I am not marrying anyone today, Mr. Crane," Sadie said, loud enough to carry across the whole churchyard, "and I think everyone here deserves to know why before you rush me inside to sign a register that would bury your crimes along with my father's freedom." A murmur went through the crowd. Crane's smile did not waver, but his eyes had gone sharp and cold. "Your father's freedom depends entirely on this marriage, Miss Grady, as you well know. Refuse it, and Sheriff Dobbs here has a warrant ready to execute this very hour." "On a debt that never existed," Stephen said, stepping up beside Sadie. "Recorded in a ledger you altered with your own hand, Mr. Crane. We have proof, not accusations. Proof. The original record of every one of these debts, showing them paid in full, recovered from your own property after the flood exposed your root cellar. Judge Teal has seen it and is riding for Salmon this very hour to rule on it." "The judge is not here," Crane said, and for the first time a note of genuine strain entered his voice. "I see no judge, Doctor. I see a sheriff with a lawful warrant and a debt properly recorded, and I see no legal reason why this wedding should not proceed exactly as planned." It was at that moment, with the crowd murmuring uneasily and Sheriff Dobbs shifting his weight, uncertain which way to move, that the sound of a hard-ridden horse reached them from the road, and Judge Harmon Teal, mud-spattered and grim, reined up before the church steps with 2 deputies from the Yankee Fork camp behind him, having ridden through the night rather than lose even a single hour to the deadline he had been warned of. "I believe," Judge Teal said, swinging down from his horse with the stiff care of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle, "that I am not too late after all, though it appears to have been a very near thing." He looked around the churchyard, taking in Crane's stricken expression, Sadie's set jaw, Thomas Grady's exhausted relief. "Sheriff Dobbs, I will take charge of that warrant now, and I would ask everyone here to remain a few moments longer, because I have a ruling I believe this whole valley has an interest in hearing." What followed took less than 20 minutes, though it felt to Stephen like the resolution of everything that had happened since that first frozen morning in the Grady's Ford dooryard. Judge Teal laid out the evidence plainly, for the crowd as much as for the record, the original ledger against the altered one, Foster Reams's sworn testimony, given without hesitation now that his mother's debt no longer hung over him, the Whitfields' account of their own stolen bottomland. He did not need long to reach his conclusion. "It is the finding of this court," Judge Teal said, his voice carrying clear and hard across the churchyard, "that Elias Crane did knowingly and repeatedly falsify banking records for the purpose of defrauding ranching families along this river of their land, including but not limited to Thomas Grady, Henry and Ada Whitfield, and at least 2 other families I intend to summon before this circuit is finished. The debt claimed against Thomas Grady is void. The auction of his cattle was unlawful, and any property or funds already taken under these false debts are to be returned in full, with damages to follow as the law allows. Furthermore, given the timing and evident purpose of the marriage arranged for this afternoon, I find ample grounds to consider it coerced under threat of unlawful imprisonment, and I will personally ensure no such marriage proceeds under this court's jurisdiction today or any day, so long as that coercion stands unaddressed. Sheriff Dobbs, you will take Mr. Crane into custody pending formal charges." The churchyard erupted into a confusion of relief and astonishment, neighbors turning to one another in disbelief and vindication both, while Crane, his face gone the color of old paper, was led away by a sheriff who had, moments before, been prepared to arrest Thomas Grady on his say-so alone. Whitman Crane, for his part, looked more relieved than anyone else present, slipping quietly away from the church steps without a single word of protest. Thomas Grady crossed to his daughter and folded her into an embrace that spoke more than any words could have, both of them silent for a long moment amid the swirling crowd. "You did this," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "You and the doctor. You saved us, Sadie." "We saved us," Sadie corrected, though her eyes over her father's shoulder had already found Stephen's and held there. It was later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the sheriff had ridden off with Crane in custody, and Thomas Grady had been persuaded, over vigorous objection, to go home and rest properly for the first time in weeks, that Stephen found Sadie standing alone by the church fence, looking out over the darkening river valley with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "You never did finish telling me," Stephen said, coming to stand beside her, "what you felt for me that night in the storm shelter, before you decided it was safer to call it gratitude." Sadie's laugh was soft, tired, and entirely without her earlier guardedness. "I believe I have run out of reasons to call it anything but what it is, Stephen Lockhart. I love you. I have for some weeks now, though I fought it every mile of the way, because I did not think it right to want a man who belonged to someone else." "I no longer belong to anyone else," Stephen said. "Louisa released me from that promise 3 days ago, with more grace than I likely deserved, because she had discovered the same truth I had, that we mistook a sensible arrangement for love, and that neither of us was willing to spend a lifetime pretending otherwise." He reached for her hand, gloved fingers finding gloved fingers in the cold evening air. "I rode past my own wedding to reach yours, Sadie. I do not intend to spend whatever years I have left riding past the thing I actually want." "And what is it you want?" Sadie asked, though her voice had gone soft and her eyes bright in the last of the daylight. "You," Stephen said simply. "Your stubbornness and your courage, and the way you can turn a stranger's fear into a plan faster than any man I have ever met. I want to build a life on this river beside you, Sadie Grady, if you will have a doctor who rides half asleep and forgets to eat when a patient needs him, and who very nearly let the woman he loved be forced into marrying another man because he did not speak up soon enough. "You spoke up in time," Sadie said. "That is what matters." She stepped closer, close enough that Stephen could see the whole of her face clearly in the fading light. The exhaustion, the joy, the same fierce determination that had first caught his attention in her father's frozen dooryard. "I want that too, Stephen, all of it. The circuit and the cold and the schoolhouse I still mean to build, board by board, whether the county board approves it or not." "I believe," Stephen said, "that after today the county board may find itself considerably more inclined toward your schoolhouse than it was yesterday." "Perhaps," Sadie said, smiling now, wide and unguarded, "though I confess I have stopped needing their approval to know the thing is worth doing." Stephen reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, the same gesture he had made once before, by torchlight beside a flood, and this time neither of them stepped back from it. "May I kiss you, Sadie Grady?" "You had better, Dr. Lockhart," Sadie said, "after everything it has cost us to arrive at this particular moment." He kissed her there by the church fence, in the last gray light of a bitter winter evening, with the frozen river running quiet and patient below them and the whole wide valley settling into dusk around them. And it was, Stephen thought, worth every mile of frozen road and every hour of fear that had brought them to it. They were married the following spring, once the county board moved partly by public sentiment and partly, Sadie suspected, by simple embarrassment at how badly they had misjudged her finally approved funds and a proper building for the Cedar Bend schoolhouse, which opened its doors the same week as their wedding, so that Sadie spent her wedding morning, by her own insistence, arranging desks before she ever arranged her own dress. Louisa Marsh attended, on Sadie's own invitation, standing beside William Caro with an easy happiness that put to rest any last awkwardness between them. Thomas Grady, restored fully to health by a summer free of bankers' threats, walked his daughter down the short aisle of the same church where her wedding to Whitman Crane had nearly, disastrously, taken place, and gave her away with tears he made no effort to hide. Elias Crane stood trial that same spring before Judge Teal, and was convicted on charges of fraud sufficient to see every acre and every dollar he had stolen returned to the families he had wronged, with a sentence that ensured the valley would not see him free again for a good many years. Stephen kept his circuit, riding between Cedar Bend and Bitterroot Camp and Elkhorn Crossing much as he always had, though now he rode home each week to a small ranch house, near Grady's Ford that he and Sadie had built with their own hands, and the willing help of neighbors who had not forgotten what the two of them had done for the whole valley. Sadie kept her schoolhouse, teaching ranch children their letters and their sums through the winter months and helping her father with the cattle come spring. And in the evenings, when Stephen's work brought him home tired and half-frozen from some long day's ride, she would meet him at the door with warm broth and warmer hands, and neither of them ever again mistook duty for love, nor love for anything less than the whole, chosen, hard-won thing it had become between them. There would be no children in those first years, though neither minded the waiting, content instead in the quiet, deep companionship of two people who had found, in the coldest season of their lives, the one warmth that did not fail, each other, freely chosen, freely kept, on a river that ran on toward spring long after the ice that had once nearly divided them had melted away for good.